So very quickly, who am I? Again, my name is Jennifer Wong. I'm a software engineer at Eventbrite. This is my cat, Fry, and you can find me on GitHub under Genzor or on Twitter under my blue wristband. I'm also very jet lagged. I'm also getting a little bit sick, so I apologize if I start to lose my voice or if I have to drink some water in between. Before I get started talking about accessibility, I like to talk about a privilege check. So for me, that means that I am cisgendered, which means I identify with the gender I was born with. I'm straight or heterosexual. I come from a middle to upper middle class family. I have no physical, social, or learning disabilities. I'm college educated, and I have a socially acceptable body type. So while I'm talking about accessibility today, it's a very basic overview of accessibility, and while I try to empathize with those living with disabilities, I can't say exactly what it's like to live in a world that's inaccessible. So I'm constantly learning more and more about accessibility, and this is not the end-all be-all to accessibility here. So I first became interested in accessibility when I attended a conference called jQuery SF, and that was in San Francisco. There was a whole section of that presentation called The Importance of Being Accessible. And that was hosted by a man named Jennison Asuncion. He's an accessibility advocate, and he started a meetup group, and he also is the founder of the Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and that falls on May 18th every year. And there are events around the world recognizing accessibility. So during that section, we also heard from Caro Karan, and she talked about what it's like being a partially sighted user of the internet. So she showed us what it's like for her to see the internet through her eyes. We also heard from John Cooperman, and he talked about going from a developer to an ally and what it was like to learn about and do accessibility from a developer's standpoint. And then lastly, we heard from Victor Saran, and he talked about the importance of modern web and accessibility, and he focused mainly on the ARIA, or Accessible Rich Internet Application spec. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So once I saw all of this, and I was like, I want to know more about accessibility, and I'm sure that's why many of you are here today too. So what is accessibility? To find that out, I decided to go to the most reliable source on the internet, Wikipedia. And here we see that Wikipedia says, web accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites by people with disabilities. When sites are correctly designed, developed, and edited, all users have equal access to information and functionality. So here are some people who require accessibility in order to surf the web and do other things with technology. The first you'll see here on the left, this is Beverly Reddick, and she's helping customers at Travis Air Force Base, and you can see her guide dog here. In the top left, you'll see a man, a senior, who's using Norwood services to acquire tuition so that he can learn or continue learning and further his education. You can also see he's using a keyboard that is magnified so that he can see it a little bit better. And then on the bottom right, you see Chieko Asakawa, and she's an IBM fellow. She's using an app called NavCog, and that helps you navigate through physical spaces for those who are blind, such as herself. So this is just a small example of people who require accessibility in order to use technology, but who else needs accessibility? Everyone. When you make your site more accessible, that helps everyone. And people like to say that we're slowly aging into accessibility or aging into disability. So me, for example, many years, I didn't wear glasses, and because I work on the web every day, I'm staring very closely at a computer every day. I started wearing glasses a couple years ago. So I find things very hard to read sometimes, and I'll have to have my glasses on. So that's something to remember, because in web development, oftentimes we tend to be younger, and you have to remember as you get older, you may develop arthritis, you may develop visual disabilities that you didn't think about when you were younger. So who else is everyone? Those may be people who have visual disabilities, and we automatically think of people who are blind, but that just may mean that people have low vision or they have blurriness on the edge of their vision. There are also people who have motor or mobility disabilities, and that could be just difficulty using their hands. So, someone with arthritis maybe can't use a mouse as easily. There are auditory disabilities, and we automatically, again, think of deafness, but that actually just may mean you're hard of hearing. I, for example, have tinnitus in one ear, so I have a little bit of ringing in one of my ears. Those people may also have seizures, and that includes photoepileptic seizures caused by flashing events, and that's something to consider as well. And lastly, there are people who have cognitive or intellectual disabilities. And automatically we think of people who have developmental disabilities, but that may include people who are dyslexic as well. Oftentimes when we think of people using the web with disabilities, we think that they're a minority of users. But there's a graph here. I'm sorry that it's US focused, but I pulled it from Google. The first one you'll see is this yellow bar down here, and just in the US, people with accessible needs surfing the internet who are blind or low vision total more than the entire population of Canada, Italy, Mexico, and the Czech Republic. And then again, just in the United States, those with accessible needs who are deaf or hard of hearing total more than all of the populations of those countries, and then also the entire population of Spain. And they're very close also to the entire population of South Korea and France. So obviously this is not a minority user here. Some more statistics. In the US, 18.7% of the population have some type of disability, and 12.6% have a severe disability. Here in Poland, 12.2% have a type of disability, and about 4% have a severe disability. And estimates up to 7.5% of the internet population worldwide is estimated to have a disability. So again, it's a lot of people. These are a lot of people you'd be reaching by making your website accessible. And something interesting we noticed at Eventbrite is that about 30% of our users are people over the age of 45. And we also noticed that the bounce rate for those people were much higher. So again, that may be due to usability issues. You can't see as well, or maybe you have trouble navigating the website, things like that. So again, something else to consider. So why should you do accessibility? Well, you guys are already here at this talk, so we can all be accessibility allies. The first thing I like to point out is that this abbreviation, A11Y, is not really accessible. For those of you who don't know, there are 11 letters between the A and the Y in accessibility. So it's similar to I18N, which is internationalization. And I find that also a little bit confusing. So we like to spell out the entire word just to be accessible as well. Why else should you do accessibility? It's the law, kind of, here. So the United Nations Convention the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has Article 9, and Article 9 is created to promote access for persons with disabilities to new information and communication technologies, such as the internet. So again, it's just a guideline. It's an article that exists with the United Nations. And in about 8 participating countries, including Poland, that actually only applies to public providers of internet applications. There's also the European standard, EN 301-549 V1.1.2. Try to remember that. That was passed by the European Parliament as part of the European Union, and it requires all public sector websites and apps to be accessible. So it requires that, but it's more of a guideline. And what they're expecting is that there should be accessibility laws and regulations created by sometime in September of next year. So those laws are expected to enforce accessibility, but again, they're not coming out until next year. Interestingly, also, I found this website. It's the Prime Minister's website here in Poland. And I guess in 2012, they redid their website, so it was more accessible, which is pretty exciting, but unfortunately, the video is all in Polish, so I don't know exactly what they're saying. So if anyone wants to watch it and translate, that would be really great. So again, it's the law. There are times when you may be faced with a lawsuit. One of the first here was, or first in the world, was by Bruce McGuire versus the Sydney Organizing Committee for the Olympic Games. He filed a complaint with the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission in Australia, and that was because he couldn't access content on the Olympic website. So he won that suit. The courts required SOCOG to make the changes to be accessible, and SOCOG didn't do that, and they were fined 20,000 Australian dollars. So that's just one small example in 1999 of an accessibility lawsuit. And during that time, Bruce McGuire said, "It's an ongoing campaign to raise awareness about web accessibility and to keep asserting the fact that people with a disability have as much right to choice and inclusion as the rest of the community." So really, it's not about the amount of money that was required or awarded by SOCOG. It's about making the websites accessible. So there are web accessibility laws around the world in Australia, Brazil, the European Union, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So if your web application or your business operates in any of these countries, that's something to consider. Or if you're considering internationalizing your company, remember that all of these places actually have laws requiring web accessible content. Some other lawsuits that happened, in 2008, the National Federation for the Blind in the United States sued Target in a class action lawsuit. They won, and Target was required to pay out $6 million. And that doesn't include the $4 million they paid out in legal fees. Most recently, we saw Juan Carlos Gil file a lawsuit against the Winn-Dixie stores in the US, and that's a grocery chain. So the courts found that Winn-Dixie had to spend $250,000 just towards making their websites accessible, and they required them to comply within 30 days. So again, that's something to consider. If you get sued, you might have to comply within 30 days, versus right now, if you're starting to become accessible, you have much more time. Other reasons to do accessibility, it automatically increases your SEO. And something to note, Googlebot is the world's most prolific blind user of the internet. Okay, now we're going to get into how do you do accessibility. So the first thing you'll want to look at are some web standards. And in general, what we do look at are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and that's put out by W3C, or the Worldwide Web Consortium. Interestingly, in the US, we have Section 508, and that essentially just follows WCAG as well. We look at version 2.0 and AA compliance. And with the European Union, it's kind of interesting because they're actually still looking at version 1.0. So they haven't actually legally looked or expected the laws to be upgraded to version 2.0. And there are actually some criticisms about these standards, even though they are standard across the world. The first of which is that they do not sufficiently put the user at the heart of the process. They don't specifically address those with intellectual or cognitive disabilities. They don't keep up with current technology. WCAG 2.0 came out in 2008, and that's about 10 years ago. And the guidelines are also very difficult to navigate, which I'm going to show you guys here. Okay, so these are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and I often like to look for, maybe color contrast. What are the requirements of color contrast? All right, so there's an abstract, there's the status of this document, there's a table of contents with a lot of words, and I don't see color contrast on there. There's an introduction, there's layers of guidance, there's some supporting documents, terms. Okay, we're at the guidelines. So if I keep going, maybe I'll find some color contrasts. Oh, here we go. Okay. So we finally made it after that wall of text, and you can see it's pretty hard to navigate. And also you can see there's these two links, and one says how to meet the guidelines and then understanding the guidelines. So I'm not really sure why understanding comes second. I feel like I need to understand them and then decide I need to know how to meet them. So as you can see, it's a bit confusing. And that's why it's one of the criticisms of WCAG. Okay, back to our slides. So again, with respect to learning cognitive disabilities, I saw something recently when I was in Seattle. So this is a map of the Link train in Seattle, and that's their light rail system. A lot of people who have intellectual cognitive disabilities have a hard time reading, and they have a hard time like recognizing letters and words. So one great thing I thought that Seattle did was that each of their stations has a little image associated. So when you're taking the train, you don't necessarily need to read the station name. You can just look at the image and recognize what station you're at and what station you need to go to. This map doesn't reflect it, but each station also had a color associated with it. So maybe if you don't recognize the image, you can recognize the color so you know that where you are. I like to say it's similar to Disneyland for anyone who's gone. Their parking lots have a character. So you're like, oh, I'm on the Donald Duck floor. That's how you can remember that. Something else about standards. So WC3 actually recently approved Silver, which is a new set of accessibility guidelines. And the way that they got that name, I found out, was that accessibility guidelines, the acronym is AG, which is a chemical symbol for silver. Very cute. So it's really great because they just got approved last year, and you can actually participate in the process of writing these standards. So you could be a stakeholder, or you can give advice, or you can help with writing those standards if you really enjoy accessibility. And again, if you really, really enjoy accessibility, there's actually a workshop right after this today, and that's in room Shenzhen, and that's hosted by Tanya and Tim. So hopefully you get to learn a lot more if you go to that workshop then. All right, now, how else do you do accessibility once you have those standards? So the next thing you want to do is you want to do a lot of testing. The first thing I like to do is I like to tab through a website and see if I can get through an entire website, do the things I need to do just by hitting the tab key. You can also try using standard keyboard shortcuts to make sure that they are used the way that they're supposed to be used on a website. You can also use screen readers. There are many types. JAWS, Window Eyes, and NVDA work for Windows. Note that NVDA is free and slowly becoming more and more popular because of that. VoiceOver is available on iOS and Mac, and it's included for free, which is great. And then TalkBack is accessible on Android devices. So you can see here there was a survey done by WebAIM, and they looked at the most popular or primary screen readers for those with accessible needs. And again, you can see JAWS is very popular because it's the most extensive of screen readers, but NVDA is slowly becoming more and more popular. And then quickly some numbers behind that. Other ways to test is if you can get your hands on these things. There are many types of assistive technologies that make it easier for people with disabilities to navigate websites and applications. So at the top, you'll see a Braille reader, which outputs Braille. And then below that, you'll see a high contrast keyboard for people who have visual disabilities. Here you see Billy Garrison, and he has low mobility of his hands, so he has tools on his hands to help him type. In the top right, you'll see David Riley, who's legally blind, but he actually is checking out people at the base store. So you can see he's like leaning into this high contrast keyboard so that he can see it better. And then at the very bottom, you'll see Bernie Worry, and he is actually using Zoom text to check on the accessibility of a website. Here's a quick photo of a 2001 diversity conference, and you can see all types of assistive technologies here. So there's like other high contrast keyboards. They're all in different configurations. If you have low mobility, it makes it much easier for you to use. And then there's like a Braille reader, and there are also single switch on-screen keyboards as well. More assistive technology, people may use a mouse stick or a head wand, which are shown here. And then a chin controller. So this is Raymond Jenks, and he's got his chin controller, and he's using a computer input device, he's taking phone calls, he's drinking water, all with this one device, which is pretty amazing. There's also eye tracking devices, and then again, the single switch on-screen keyboard for those with low mobility, and you can use those with either your hand or your foot. And here's another example of one. How else can you test? Web validators are super helpful for the basics. There's Wave by WebAIM, there's Axe by Deck University, and there's Totally by Khan Academy. So Wave and Axe both work as Chrome and Firefox extensions. Axe is accessible in Chrome DevTools, and Totally can actually be installed on your dev or QA sites. Or if you're feeling like really, really adventurous and super into accessibility, you can put it on your production site too. Other ways of testing, you'll want to check the color contrast of your website. So there are a few here listed. There's WebAIM, there's Contrast Checker, and there's Accessible Colors. Accessible Colors is pretty cool because they'll actually suggest a better color for you to use. There's another extension called No Coffee, and that simulates visual disabilities. So I think here I've turned up cloudiness, I've turned up blur, and contrast. And so you can see this is what Eventbrite's homepage looks like with all of those things turned up. Other ideas for testing: fully remove CSS and try to navigate the website. Try in-person user testing, so bring in people with disabilities to test your website for you, and make sure you pay them. Try blindfolds or blacked out glasses, or just completely turn down your screen brightness so you can't see your screen. And then use a screen reader. Or use a color blindness or low vision simulator similar to No Coffee. Okay, how else can you do accessibility? With code. First off, use semantic HTML. So in other words, don't use a div as a span, don't use a span as an anchor, don't use an anchor as a button, or as they say in Bee and Puppycat, use the sword as a sword. Following that, more semantic HTML, make sure you have a clear heading structure and don't skip heading levels. So don't go from an H1 to an H3, just go to an H2 right after that. And I highly recommend using semantic HTML tags that we have accessible now, such as header and footer, main, things like that. With your images, maps, and charts, make sure that you have something descriptive and easily understandable as your alt tag for your image. If your image is only decorative, then have an alt attribute that's empty and nothing in it. If you have a map or a chart, make sure you have a full text description so that explains what a person would be seeing. And then with forms, what you'll want to do is make sure that every input has a label and that the label is associated to the input. So make sure you have a for and a name attribute for those respectively. And then also have consistency across your forms. So if you have one form that says login, don't have another form that says sign in. Make sure you stay consistent. With links and buttons, it's highly recommended to have a non-color indicator, such as an underline in your link, even though your designers will fight you on it. Also have a clear hover and focus state. Tab ordering. So it's highly recommended not to use tab index if you can avoid it. And that essentially will decide what is in the navigation as you're tabbing through a website. If you can't avoid using tab index, try only to use tab index of 0 or tab index of -1. So tab index of 0 essentially places something into the default tab navigation order, and then -1 will remove it. So you can remove it, but then also give it programmatic focus by using scripting. With video and animations, make sure you have closed captions. Don't autoplay your videos, and make sure you have a way to pause, play, and stop your video. Also, it's recommended to have a transcript either there or a link to it off on another page. Other things related to accessibility. Aria, for anyone who's a Game of Thrones fan. Different Aria. This ARIA is actually WAI ARIA, Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. They're really great at naming things at W3C. So ARIA for short, essentially out of the box, screen readers work really well with standard HTML or semantic HTML, so it can read things very easily. But back when ARIA was created, we didn't have semantic tags like header and footer. So ARIA was created to help screen readers better understand the layout of the page. So that being said, I like to say, just like with Arya from Game of Thrones, be very careful with Arya on the web. Don't use it all the time because it can be overkill. So the structure of Arya, very quickly, there's roles, states, and properties. So a role is essentially a main indicator of type, and it allows tools to present and support interaction with an object consistent with an object of that type. So for example, if you have a form and for some reason you can't use a form tag, then you could give it the role form in Arya. There are several types of roles in ARIA. There's the abstract role, which you can just ignore because the following three just inherit from that one. But a landmark role will actually identify large swaths of content, and they're used for navigation by a screen reader. A document role provides a structural description for a section, and they're typically non-interactive. And then a widget role will describe a common interactive pattern that doesn't actually have an HTML tag equivalent. So an example would be like a tooltip. There are ARIA states, which describe the state of an element. So there's busy, disabled, grabbed, hidden, invalid. And then there are properties. So two that I like to point out are label and labeled by, which I found really confusing. So you actually use ARIA labeled by if there's text visually available on the screen, and you use ARIA label when it's not possible to have that text available on the screen. Other things you can do with ARIA is you can have a skip link, which essentially will allow a user to skip the main navigation of the page. So as they're moving between pages, they don't have to go through the entire navigation every time. So there are ways of doing that. You can have a visible link at the top of the page, which is the most recommended. You can have a visible link elsewhere on the page, which is a little bit confusing and weird to me. You can have an invisible link, which seems kind of pointless. And then you can also have an invisible link that becomes visible in keyboard focus. And that's what we do at Eventbrite. So you see, when you first tab on our homepage, you can see the skip main navigation link. And if you click on that or you press spacebar, you'll get kicked down to our search bar here. Other ways you want to do accessibility is you'll probably want to prevent regressions. So what we do at Eventbrite actually is we use unit tests, automation tests, and then we have modular reusable components. So we're starting a design library that's made with React, and that allows us to kind of control the accessibility of each of our components. Something to note though is that user flow is really important to accessibility. So even though you're using these modular reusable components, it doesn't necessarily mean your website is accessible. Okay, demo time. So everyone pull out your device, your computer, anything, and we're gonna do a screen reader demo, and it's gonna hopefully get a little bit loud in here. Is anybody using a Windows computer or has a Windows phone? Okay, we'll start with you then. So I think you can start and stop narrator by clicking on the Windows logo key, Control, and Enter. Or maybe not. Okay, can you turn up the volume? Great. Okay. Anyone with an Android device? Okay, so you go to settings, and you should be able to find TalkBack. Something to note with a mobile device is you'll want to double tap to click on anything. If you single tap, it'll just read out to you what the element is. And that'll be really important for when you actually want to turn off TalkBack. So I have like a few instructions here on my super old phone that's running like Jelly Bean. I think that's Android 4.3. Cool. Do you want to turn it louder? Nice. Does anybody have a Mac computer? Okay, if you press Command F5, that'll turn on VoiceOver. And then for anyone with an iOS device, great. You can go to your general settings and then go to accessibility and turn on VoiceOver. And the same applies with double clicking or double tapping versus single tapping. All right, what I like to do is also turn on VoiceOver on my end. And then I like to put the conference website on the spot a little bit. I'm sorry if any of you are the people who created this website. It's actually pretty good. It's not bad. So, could I have volume?
VoiceOver on Finder,
great,
desktop. Screenshot 2017202 at 93144 p.m. Chrome, Code Europe, the largest programming conference in Poland. Window, Code Europe, the largest programming conference in Poland. Web content has keyboard focus.
Great.
You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, visited link. Logo Code Europe.
Okay,
Navigation
that's good.
1 item. Visited link. Buy ticket. List 6 items. You are currently on the...
So this is helpful because
link.
you actually know that there are 6
List
items
6
in your
items.
navigation list.
Visited link. Visited link. Link. Workshop link. Job offers link. Company. More button. Navigation 1 item.
Okay, let's
You
see
are
what
currently
more
on a
is.
button. To click this button, press Control Option Space. Press More button.
Okay, so we're still on more, which I thought was a little bit interesting. You can see in the top right there. So let's see what happens when I tab
Button.
next.
You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control Option Space.
Okay, I'm on a button, but I don't know what the button is. So let's keep going. It's actually good in a modal to first navigate to a close, though, so that's good. I just don't know it's a close yet.
Link. Workshops. List. Visited link. Speakers. Visited link. Link. Job offers link. Company. Your email address star. Edit text navigation to items.
My email
You are
address.
currently on
Where-
a text field. To enter text
Oh.
in this field, type link. Companies. Your email address star. Edit text
I didn't know
navigation
that
to
that
items.
was for me to sign up for the
You
newsletter.
are
I'm not
currently
looking
on
at
a
the
text
screen,
field.
so...
To enter send button.
Okay.
Link. Location visited link.
So one thing I
link,
like to
link,
point out
link,
on this
visited
website
link,
was
visited link. You buy ticket
once-
button banner 1 item.
once I
link.
get to the end of this modal-
UCHDVVE, buy ticket button banner 1 item.
I'm suddenly like
You are
taken
currently
off
on a
the
button.
modal.
To click this
So
button,
it's really
press
important
Control,
to
Option,
trap
space.
focus in a modal, but modals are really hard. So I give credit for actually being able to like land on the X first and things like that. One other thing I like to show with VoiceOver.
Code Europe 2017
Okay,
workshop.
turning you off.
VoiceOver off.
If you go to VoiceOver Utilities, if you have a Mac computer, you can go to Speech, and you can choose all types of voices and languages. So obviously, like I like a British accent, and that's why I have Kate. But there are also these silly ones that are novelty, like bad news.
The best way to predict the future is to invent it.
You know, in case you're like a little bit bored while you're testing accessibility, you can have a little bit of fun with it. I haven't been able to find an equivalent on Windows or TalkBack, unfortunately, or Narrator and TalkBack. Okay, so that's the end of the demo. Is everyone like out of their screen reader? Everything's okay? Okay. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay. So finishing up, I'm just going to talk about what it's like to do accessibility at Eventbrite. When we got started, there's a woman named Ali Lacker, and she started out at Eventbrite as a senior software engineer and eventually became an engineering manager. And she started out this entire accessibility project, which I eventually took over. The first thing she did was she acquired buy-in from higher-ups, and this is really important in order to put some money behind accessibility. So she talked about benefits of accessibility, which included sales benefits. So for us at Eventbrite, some of our clients or organizers are schools, and schools take in federal funding, and therefore we need to be Section 508 compliant. So she talked about the importance of being able to do that so that we can close more clients who are schools. There are legal benefits, which is that you don't get sued. There are consumer benefits, of course, which means that your website is more accessible for everyone. And then international benefits, because once you're accessible, you're probably complying with most laws around the world. The next thing she did, once she got approval, was to have WebAIM, or web accessibility in mind, run an audit of all of our main consumer flows. So we came away with an audit, and we had all of these bugs that we created in order to improve accessibility on our site. And quickly, for those of you who don't know, WebAIM is a nonprofit organization. They operate out of the Center for Persons with Disabilities in Utah State University. And they've been around since 1999. They're really great. They put out a ton of amazing content that's super helpful, but you can also partner with them and work with them. Ali also put together a cross-functional team. So we had engineers. We have offices also in Nashville, Tennessee, and then in Mendoza, Argentina. So we have engineers from all of those offices working on accessibility or keeping an eye on it. We have someone in content strategy, someone in sales. We have some designers. We have customer support, QA, and also legal. So you'll notice there's one thing missing, and that's actually our product team. It's really important to involve your product team because they are the ones who are going to put accessibility on the roadmap. And that's something that we learned. We also put together a ton of documentation. So in Google Drive, we have some centralized docs, and then we have a bunch of videos as well, such as Ali presenting what it's like to do accessibility. And then we also have our own internal documentation. Eventually, what I'd like to do is just have a centralized repo that we can eventually publish with all of our accessibility requirements for Eventbrite. Some tools that we use a color contrast analyzer, and that's for Sketch, and that's something our designers use. We actually have totally installed on our dev and QA environments. We use the ESLint plugin, JSX Ally plugin, and that's because we're starting to switch everything over to React. And then we have a bunch of acceptance tests. So here's our color contrast analyzer for Sketch. Unfortunately, I don't have Sketch, so I couldn't get a good screenshot of that being used. But here we have totally installed on our QA site. So down here at the bottom left, it starts out as a little teeny tab with some spectacles. And when you click on it, you can actually validate the website in different aspects, such as color contrast or heading structure. Other things we use, we have a bunch of acceptance tests in Python, mostly written by Ali. So we have this base class for accessibility. And for example, here we're checking images and making sure that they all have alt text. Some other ones, we're making sure all of our inputs have labels and things like that. So that can really help with regressions again. Something I highly recommend if you want to get started in accessibility is do project management, have some benchmarks. We use a Jira dashboard at Eventbrite to help track that. Tracking our goals and our deadlines, and then also involving a program manager is super helpful as well. So initially our estimate was about 2 tickets per team of about 3 to 7 developers, and that was per sprint. For us, it's every 2 weeks for about 10 sprints. So about 2.5 months, and we would have been finished with our accessibility project. So here's the Jira dashboard that I created, and it kind of allowed people to see what teams were doing well, how many accessibility tickets we were closing, things like that. Something I highly recommend is don't work alone. Make sure you involve other people. You don't want to be the sole accessibility expert. Here you'll see we hosted a workshop in Mendoza, and everyone has their screen brightness turned down. Everyone's got headphones on. There were designers, QA, engineers, and developers there. And I just asked them to do a couple of things. Just sign up for an account or log into your account on Eventbrite and purchase 1 ticket to any event on Eventbrite. I gave them an hour and no one could do it. So that really brought home the message that your site needs to be accessible and oftentimes is not.
And after 10 sprints?
After 10 sprints. So I'm getting to that. I'm going to skip over this. It's just like an example. You can see someone put in this button that the designers were really upset about. It does improve accessibility, but also it's kind of ugly. So it's making sure your developers and your designers work together. Also, not working alone, we were able to spread the message. One of our engineers, Lucas Padovan, I found out he gave an accessibility talk in Argentina recently, and that was wonderful. Again, so what happened? So for us at Eventbrite, it's a work in progress. I like to say sorry for any convenience caused. So it's something we're still working on. We're constantly working on it. And for me, in the future, what I'd like to see is a more focused effort from our front-end platform team, which is the team that I'm on now. So we want to set up a lot of forward-thinking, lasting solutions. For example, our design system, which is in React. So making sure that all of our reusable components are accessible. And then, as I mentioned earlier, having a GitHub repo with all of our accessibility requirements, and eventually open sourcing that. And hopefully by doing so, we'll be able to get accessibility more into the mindset of people at Eventbrite. I have some resources. I'll post my slides online so you guys can grab those. And that's it. Thank you. Are there any questions? Or feel free to just come up here and ask questions as well.
Did you anyhow try to overcome people with disabilities with this thinking disabilities, intelligent one?
Addressing cognitive and intellectual disabilities. It's something that we're looking at very slowly. We have many engineers who actually have dyslexia at Eventbrite. And so it's something that we consider because for them, it's harder for them to read our website oftentimes as well. It's something that I need to work on more with our design team though. Go ahead.
Do you have to deal with internationalization?
What's that?
With translation, with different countries,
Mm-hmm.
languages, do you have to deal with that?
Yes, we do. We actually have a localization team. So it's headed up by actually a non-engineer, but a man who, his name is Patrick, and he heads up a team of translators around the world in all of the countries that we operate in. So
Are there any problems involving them into accessibility process?
nothing that I can think of. So with them, just having things correctly translated is really important. We actually at Eventbrite have a really good culture around that. So we make sure that everything is translated. And it happens about twice weekly. And I wouldn't say it affects accessibility at all, except that it makes it better because we're making it more accessible for more people.
What about content creators? Do they have to take into account that they might possibly create content for people with visual disability or even blind people?
In general, I'm trying to think of our content creators. In general, so we just try to use platforms and tools that consider accessibility. So because it's mostly behind the scenes, not necessarily the words, we just make sure that we're working with companies that have accessibility in mind as well. It is something, though, to still consider with cognitive and intellectual disabilities as well.
How do you start making people care about the topic as a whole? Right? So a common resistance that I see is that people say our customers don't need this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't have such customers, and it's a chicken and egg. We don't have such customers because we haven't really made it accessible for them.
Right.
How do you break into the mindset?
So I think forcing someone into a situation where it makes the website harder to use. For example, tabbing, maybe you want to use keyboard focus, or for me, having a website that's harder to see, and also using a computer that maybe doesn't have this perfect Mac resolution can be helpful because you're oh, those colors are weird, or I can't read this as well. So I think bringing home the message by doing things in person for them really helps, or watching people use the website who have disabilities, I think is also very important. Any other questions?
Do you test your website accessibilities against the weak net connections,
So I would say that's like something we test more on like the performance side. So something we were looking at were like progressive web apps. And so we have one engineer who's like very focused on that. And we have a couple of engineers who are working as a performance team. So it is something that we look at, but not nearly as much as we should. But good point. Anyone else? You find a designer who's interested in accessibility. So not all of our designers are, but there are a couple who are very interested in it. And that's essentially the best solution. Or again, like showing them what it's like to use a website with a disability, or showing them what their site looks like on a screen that's not perfect. So they can see what more of the people are seeing instead of those who can like afford these like fancy MacBooks. Okay, I think we're out of time, right? Okay. Thanks, everybody.